What if God didn't exist? Would everything be permitted? This question echoes through the centuries like a scream, and it was Dostoevsky who hurled it into the heart of modernity. In a world that no longer believes in absolute truths, he forces us to stare into the abyss. Hell is freedom without meaning. If you feel like something inside you is crying out for meaning, if you've ever stared into the void and felt the void stare back, then this video is for you. Today, we dive into Dostoevsky's philosophy for the desperate, a dark and brilliant map of the human soul, where faith, nihilism, guilt, and freedom violently collide. Get ready. This isn't a video for those seeking comfort. It's for those seeking truth, even if it hurts. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. This quote, attributed to Ivan Karamazov, echoes like both an ontological and ethical sentence on the foundations of human morality. It's not just a religious speculation, it's a radical philosophical provocation. If the idea of God disappears, does good still exist? Can evil still be condemned or even recognized in a world where the absolute has been abolished? Dostoevsky invites us into a dark but necessary territory, ethical nihilism, where the old certainties have collapsed and the human being stands face to face with the abyss of their own freedom. When Ivan says, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted, he's not preaching faith, quite the opposite. He represents the enlightened skeptic, the intellectual who fully understands the weight of freedom without transcendence. And that's precisely what makes him so unsettling. This isn't a defense of religion, it's a brutal analysis of the logical consequence of a world without an absolute moral foundation. If there is no moral God, then there is no objective good or evil, only personal preferences, social conventions, individual desires, and temporary agreements. And what does that mean? It means evil is no longer evil in essence. It becomes just a violation of social consensus. Torturing a child, for example, might be considered evil, but according to whom? Dostoevsky refuses this kind of relativism. In one of the most disturbing moments in the novel, Ivan tells true stories of children being tortured and says not even eternal paradise could justify such innocent suffering. For Dostoevsky, the problem of evil isn't theoretical, it's visceral, unbearable, and screams against any system that tries to downplay it. Freedom without God, liberation or condemnation. If God doesn't exist, human freedom expands to infinite limits. But what do we do with that freedom? Dostoevsky shows that, instead of liberation, this limitless autonomy can become an unbearable burden. Without a transcendent reference point, freedom becomes empty will. Everything is permitted, yes, but nothing has value anymore. This is where nihilism is born, a spiritual condition where life loses its meaning and evil becomes ordinary. Nietzsche, deeply influenced by Dostoevsky, called this the death of God, a seismic event in the history of human consciousness. But while Nietzsche tries to turn that void into a triumph of the will to power, Dostoevsky follows a more tragic path. Without God, man is condemned to moral despair. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov murders a greedy old pawnbroker, believing he can justify the crime for a greater good. He sees himself as a new kind of Superman, above good and evil. But guilt, inner torment, and eventual psychological collapse reveal that even when we try to deny traditional morality, the human soul carries a conscience that accuses us from within. Dostoevsky tells us, we can deny God, but we can't escape the thirst for justice. Ivan's most painful question isn't, does God exist? It's, is God good? How can an all-powerful, loving God allow innocent people to suffer? Ivan isn't interested in theological explanations. He refuses salvation if it means buying it at the cost of a single child's tear. That refusal is an act of moral integrity, even coming from a character who denies God. Dostoevsky creates an unbearable tension here. Morality demands an absolute, but the absolute seems to allow absurd suffering. How do we reconcile that? Traditional philosophy has tried to explain the problem of evil with various theories: free will, the fall of man, evil as the absence of good, and so on. But Dostoevsky doesn't try to resolve the problem. He dramatizes it. He lives it through his characters and forces us to look it in the face. To Dostoevsky, evil isn't just the absence of God, it's the misuse of human freedom. God created man free, but that freedom can turn against the good. In The Grand Inquisitor, one of the most famous chapters in the Brothers Karamazov, the Inquisitor criticizes Jesus for giving humans freedom and says, "People don't want freedom, they want bread, order, miracles." To the Inquisitor, freedom is a curse. That's why the church must take on that burden and rule over people in the name of obedience and peace. But Dostoevsky doesn't side with the Inquisitor. On the contrary, even knowing that freedom can lead to evil, he believes that true human dignity can only exist in authentic, even tragic freedom. And if everything really is permitted, let's be honest, if everything is permitted, what stops us from killing, betraying, stealing, exploiting? Laws, fear of punishment, social norms. If those are the only boundaries, then evil isn't resisted by conscience, but by calculation. Morality becomes utilitarian, and human life becomes disposable. Dostoevsky saw this coming with prophetic clarity. He anticipated the horrors of the 20th century, when ideologies that rejected God and placed man at the center ended up justifying genocide in the name of progress, race, or revolution. Everything was permitted, and everything was done. The final plea: where does goodness come from? In the end, the phrase, "if God does not exist, then everything is permitted," isn't a naive defense of religion. It's a philosophical warning, a cry against the moral emptiness of modernity. Dostoevsky doesn't give us clear answers. He doesn't close the debate, but he forces us to face the question: if there's no God, on what authority do you call evil evil? If everything is a human construct, then a concentration camp and a hospital are just different designs of the same civilization. Can you live with that? This question is uncomfortable, but it's essential, because in the end, evil is only truly evil when we acknowledge that there is something absolutely good, inviolable, that condemns it, even if every human voice goes silent. Man prefers suffering over the burden of choice. Fyodor Dostoevsky. The Brothers. Karamazov. Freedom. A word celebrated, idolized, sung in anthems, and waved on flags. But Dostoevsky, instead of staying on the surface of rhetoric, dives deep into the human soul to reveal an uncomfortable truth. Freedom is terrifying. It demands courage, responsibility, and an ethical commitment that not everyone is willing to accept. The quote above, spoken in the context of the parable of the Grand Inquisitor, is one of the most powerful moments in Dostoevsky's critique of modern human nature. When faced with real freedom, people often reject it. They'd rather hand over their autonomy to some external authority, whether it be the state, the church, science, or any ideology, than carry the weight of deciding for themselves. Here's the paradox: we crave freedom, yet we fear it. The human longing for safety, predictability, and order often outweighs the courage to face the anxiety that comes with making choices. Dostoevsky saw that moral freedom isn't some abstract ideal. It's raw, concrete, and demanding. It's not just doing whatever you want. It means owning your decisions, in front of your own conscience, and maybe even before God. This kind of freedom doesn't come with a manual. It's wild, untamed. Carrying it means living without guarantees, knowing that every choice you make affects not just your own life, but the world around you. That's why the Inquisitor says, man prefers suffering to the burden of choice. The pain others impose on us may be unjust, but at least we can understand it. The pain caused by our own decisions, that's unbearable for many. In The Grand Inquisitor, Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles, is recognized by the people, and is immediately arrested by the church. That night, the Inquisitor visits him in prison and says, "You gave us freedom, but man doesn't want it. Man wants bread, miracles, and authority." This scene is a scathing critique of religious authoritarianism and spiritual manipulation. But more than that, it's a psychological X-ray of the human soul. People want to be led. They want to follow orders, not make decisions. They want safety, not responsibility. That's why the Inquisitor claims the Church had to correct Christ's mistake by offering people what they truly wanted, not freedom, but relief from freedom. For Dostoevsky, freedom and responsibility are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. True freedom is the ability to choose what is good, even when evil is easier. It's doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. But that freedom comes with a heavy weight. It forces us to face our own abyss and choose, even when we're standing at the edge of the void. Decades later, Jean-Paul Sartre would echo this same anguish by saying, "Man is condemned to be free." For Sartre, there is no God, no pre-given essence. We simply exist and must invent ourselves through every choice we make. That radical freedom, however, isolates us. It leaves us naked in a world without built-in meaning. But Dostoevsky doesn't see freedom as an existential curse. He sees it as a spiritual drama. And that's what makes his view even deeper. He sees freedom as sacred, but also tragic. The social psychologist Erich Fromm would later revisit this theme in his book, Escape from Freedom. He observed that when humans are freed from external structures of authority, like tradition, religion, or absolute states, they don't feel empowered. They feel lost, and in that disorientation, they search for new forms of submission, totalitarian regimes, cults, ideologies, gurus, messianic leaders. Dostoevsky saw all of this coming. To him, the problem of freedom isn't political, it's moral and spiritual. Even in a free society, a person can become a slave to their impulses, to desire, to consumerism, vanity, or intellectual pride. Freedom without moral responsibility isn't freedom, it's decay. And the longing for security can easily become an excuse to abandon one's conscience. Dostoevsky doesn't romanticize human nature. He knows us too well, our contradictions, our fears, our moments of cowardice. But he also knows we're capable of greatness. And that greatness begins when we accept our freedom with responsibility. To Dostoevsky, the true hero isn't the one who conquers the world. It's the one who conquers himself, the one who chooses good, even while suffering, who stays true to an inner sense of right, even while surrounded by doubt, who rises with humility, even after falling. Moral responsibility has a price. It requires conscience, and conscience hurts. As another character in The Brothers Karamazov says, each person is guilty for everyone and everything. That might sound extreme, but it points to a powerful ethical idea. Freedom only becomes real when the individual accepts their active role in shaping the moral world around them. It's important to note that Dostoevsky distinguishes between authentic freedom and blind, impulsive will. The Underground Man, for example, is a parody of freedom. He acts against logic, against the good, just to assert his own will. He destroys himself to prove he's not a slave to any system. But that's not the kind of freedom Dostoevsky admires. It's the madness of wounded pride. Authentic freedom is something else. It's not selfish. It's not childish. It's responsible. It looks at another person's pain and asks, "What must I do?" It chooses love, even when it could choose anything else. At its core, Dostoevsky's message is this: freedom isn't just a right, it's a calling to become who you are, to act with justice, to love with truth, to carry the world's pain as if it were your own. It's not easy, it never was, but that's where human dignity begins. Maybe it's true that people often prefer suffering to the burden of choice, but it's also true that when someone chooses to be truly free, fully and consciously, they become greater than all their suffering. There is no virtue if there is no immortality. Fyodor Dostoevsky, A Writer's Diary. This statement cuts like a blade, not just because of its sharpness, but because it strikes the most exposed nerve of modern life, the collapse of faith in life's meaning. For Dostoevsky, the idea of virtue, of goodness, justice, sacrifice, is inseparably tied to the belief in something that transcends death. When that belief dissolves, the entire moral structure begins to crumble. That's the essence of nihilism, the experience of complete emptiness that sets in when all metaphysical, religious, and moral certainties are destroyed, and nothing is put in their place. More than any other 19th century writer, Dostoevsky embodied that drama. He didn't just reflect on nihilism, he dramatized its consequences deep within the human soul. Modernity brought many achievements: science, technology, political freedom, secularization. But it also brought a deep, silent crisis, the replacement of eternal meaning with functional meaning. What was once guaranteed by God and the immortality of the soul is now handed over to chance, biology, and society. Dostoevsky watched this process with deep unease. He saw that losing belief in immortality wasn't just about losing religious comfort. It also meant the collapse of virtue itself. Why? Because to him, acting virtuously means going against your own immediate interests, resisting selfishness, sacrificing for others. And why would anyone do that if there's no reward, no justice, no meaning beyond the grave? It's not about fearing hell or craving paradise. It's about believing that the human soul has eternal value, and that goodness is grounded in something deeper than personal taste or social convention. When that disappears, everything becomes relative. Everything becomes negotiable. The word nihilism comes from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing. It's the state where nothing holds intrinsic value, nothing is true in itself. Good and evil become opinions. Love becomes just chemistry. Justice becomes politics. The human being, a pile of impulses and data. Dostoevsky saw nihilism not just as a philosophical stance, but as a spiritual sickness, a fever in the modern soul. His characters suffer this emptiness. They don't just question God's existence, they feel the unbearable weight of a world without God. In The Devils, also translated as demons, for example, the character Kirillov decides to commit suicide as a metaphysical act. He believes that if God doesn't exist, then man must become God, including the power over life and death. To him, suicide would be the ultimate expression of human freedom, a freedom with no moral or spiritual boundaries. But the result is tragic. He cannot carry the weight of inventing his own meaning. Absolute freedom without transcendence crushes him. Virtue without eternity. Is it possible? The question Dostoevsky poses, even without offering a definitive answer, is deeply unsettling. Can virtue exist without the idea of eternity? If there's no soul, no final judgment, if everything ends in the grave, then why be just, generous, or faithful? Some might say that morality can be built on human foundations, empathy, social contracts, evolution. But Dostoevsky saw that in moments of extreme suffering, those justifications don't hold. When someone is horribly wronged, when an innocent child suffers, it's not enough to say that empathy is evolutionarily useful. The heart cries out for absolute justice, for a goodness that death itself cannot erase. And if such goodness doesn't exist, then, as Ivan Karamazov says, everything is permitted, not in a liberating sense, but in a collapsing one. Everything is permitted because nothing matters. And that is more dangerous than any tyranny, because indifference is the perfect soil for barbarism. Dostoevsky wasn't just talking about his time, he foresaw our time. Today, nihilism is no longer a radical philosophy, it's a daily experience. Millions of people live in a kind of existential numbness. They work, consume, produce. But deep down, they feel empty. The question, what's the point of all this, echoes, even when drowned out by distractions and non-stop stimulation. Contemporary culture celebrates freedom, diversity, and pleasure, but often forgets to offer any deep sense of meaning. The result? Anxiety, disorientation, depression. The human soul was made to transcend, and when it's locked into the immediate, it starts to wither. Dostoevsky understood this. He knew that belief in the soul's immortality wasn't just a religious doctrine. It was a psychological and moral anchor. It's not about proving dogmas. It's about recognizing that without an eternal dimension, virtue risks becoming just an empty gesture. The central tension in Dostoevsky's work is between nihilism and faith. Not blind, institutional faith, but a lived, embodied, painful faith. He doesn't hand us an answer, but he shows that the absence of faith has a cost, and that the human heart, even when it rebels against God, still longs for a meaning that goes beyond itself. Nihilism is the denial of everything. But this denial, paradoxically, is born from a deep thirst for meaning. When Ivan Karamazov rejects God because of the suffering of children, he's not being indifferent. He's actually crying out for a just world, where goodness is so real, so sacred, that not even God has the right to violate it. That's the brilliance of Dostoevsky's vision. Even the most radical skeptic carries within them the longing for an absolute truth. So nihilism isn't the end, it's a critical turning point. Crisis can be the beginning of a more honest search. The dark night of the soul can come just before the dawn of a conscious faith. Dostoevsky doesn't decide for us. He places the choice in our hands. We can follow the path of nihilism, denying immortality, denying the value of good, reducing life to a cycle of matter and consumption, or we can realize that for virtue to be truly real, we need something eternal, something that death, time, and suffering can't destroy. This isn't about believing out of convenience. It's about understanding that the human soul needs more than pleasure and safety. It needs meaning. And meaning can only hold up when there's something beyond this life. You can't prove anything to the heart with arguments. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers. Karamazov reason teaches us how to think. Faith teaches us how to live. This tension, as old as human thought itself, becomes raw and personal in Dostoevsky's works. He doesn't treat it as an abstract debate between philosophy and theology, but as a real battle within the soul, where the heart longs for meaning and reason demands proof. And caught between these two voices, the human being often finds themselves torn, fragmented, searching for a truth that unites without crushing. The phrase, "You can't prove anything to the heart with arguments," isn't a rejection of reason. It's a deep recognition of what reason simply can't reach. Because some parts of life don't submit to logic or evidence. Faith is one of them, and maybe the most essential one. In Dostoevsky's world, the heart isn't just a symbol of emotion, it's the core of our being, the home of conscience, anguish, hope, and faith. And it's there, in the heart, where the real drama of existence plays out. Reason can give us analysis, explanations, arguments, but it can't fill the existential void. It doesn't comfort us in the face of death. It doesn't carry us through suffering. It doesn't give meaning to sacrifice. That's why, for Dostoevsky, faith is not a logical conclusion. It's an existential decision. It's born from surrender, from pain, from love. It's the heart's response to the mystery of life, not an intellectual formula. Alyosha, the most luminous character in The Brothers Karamazov, represents this living faith. He doesn't need proof to believe. He breathes faith like air, naturally, peacefully, intimately, not because he's naive, but because he knows there are truths that can only be known by the heart. Ivan Karamazov, on the other hand, is the voice of brilliant, rational thought. He questions the existence of God, not out of cynicism, but out of moral outrage. His rebellion is born from the suffering of children, from the senselessness of evil in the world. He wants an answer that satisfies the mind and doesn't find it. So he returns the ticket to creation. But that's the problem. Suffering can't be explained. It can only be endured. There's no logical argument that can justify the absurdity of pain. That's where faith comes in, not as cheap comfort, but as a courageous leap into the unknown. For Dostoevsky, faith isn't a denial of suffering. It's the only real answer to it. Not an explanation, but a form of redemption. And that kind of answer can't be taught like math. It has to be lived, with all the tears, doubts, and silence that come with it. Dostoevsky sees faith not as a forced belief, but as an act of radical freedom. To believe in his literary universe isn't about blindly accepting a doctrine. It's about trusting the unseen. It's about taking the risk of loving, even when there are no guarantees. His vision of Christianity is not about rules. It's deeply existential. His Christ is not a distant figure. He's a God who suffers with humanity, who humbles himself, who loves to the very end. Reason might reject that, but the heart, the one that suffers, that hopes, that gives, recognizes in that Christ the only real hope. That's why faith is not blind belief. It's a deep inner knowing that life has a greater meaning than what our eyes can see. It's the heart saying, I can't prove it, but I know. It's important to say, Dostoevsky does not reject reason. He himself was a sharp thinker, deeply familiar with the major philosophies of his time. But he saw the limits of rationality, especially when it comes to the mystery of evil, death, and human freedom. Reason alone can become cruel, cold, mechanical. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky harshly criticizes extreme rationalism, showing how it can dehumanize. The underground man is someone paralyzed by self-aware reason, unable to fully live. Reason analyzes, but it doesn't love, and without love, life loses its spark. So faith and reason aren't enemies. They are different dimensions of human experience. Reason is a powerful tool for understanding the world, but faith is what moves us through it. Reason asks, how? Faith asks, why? And it's the second question that shapes the way we live. There's a deep connection between Dostoevsky and Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Both saw faith as a leap, not into darkness, but into paradox. Kierkegaard says faith begins where reason ends, and that Christianity demands the absurd, to believe that God became man, that eternity entered time. Dostoevsky shares that vision. Faith, for him, is a scandal to logic. It means believing in love when the world is full of hate. It means forgiving when everything screams for revenge. It means hoping when there's no sign of hope. That's the scandal of faith and its unmatched beauty. That's why the phrase hits so deeply. You can't prove anything to the heart with arguments, because the heart doesn't want proof. It wants presence. It wants meaning. It wants redemption. And reason, as noble as it is, can't offer that on its own. Dostoevsky insists faith isn't passed on through speeches, but through life. Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov is the perfect example. He doesn't preach. He lives. His presence, his gaze, his silence, they transform everyone around him. Faith, here, isn't an idea. It's a force, a living energy that radiates from within. And maybe that's Dostoevsky's greatest lesson about faith. It can't be proven. It must be witnessed. And the most powerful witness is the one born out of suffering. Faith that rises from pain is the kind that has deep roots. It's not superficial. It's not rhetoric. It's flesh. It's blood. It's life. From the human heart come both the greatest evils and the greatest acts of holiness. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers. Karamazov. Dostoevsky doesn't write about the ideal man. He writes about the real one, a complex, unstable, contradictory being. Someone who can pray for peace in one moment and, the next, be consumed by thoughts of revenge. Someone capable of giving their life for love, and also of destroying everything out of pride. In Dostoevsky's world, the human being is a battlefield between good and evil. And that battle takes place in the most intimate of spaces, the heart. It's in the heart that both the purest acts of compassion and the darkest actions are born. For him, the human heart isn't completely corrupt nor completely pure. It's both at once. That's the tragedy and the glory of being alive. Dostoevsky's vision of humanity is radically anti-manic. He rejects simplistic divisions between good people and bad people, innocent and guilty, pure and perverse. The morality in his novels isn't built on flat characters. It's built on deeply real human beings, filled with inner conflict, contradictions, and the constant possibility of either redemption or ruin. That's why his characters are so unforgettable. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, is a murderer, but he's also tormented by guilt and longs for redemption. Dmitry Karamazov is impulsive, emotional, chaotic, but he also loves intensely and takes responsibility for his actions, even when he's innocent of a particular crime. To Dostoevsky, the human soul is never fully damned and never fully saved. Unlike many thinkers who saw evil as something social, structural, or external, Dostoevsky insists, evil begins within us. It's not a foreign force that invades from the outside. It grows from the human heart, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes deliberately, but always deeply human. This view is profoundly ethical because it places responsibility on the individual. There's no room here to blame everything on the system, or the government, or society, or religion. The evil is in the person, which means fighting evil doesn't begin with revolutions on the outside. It begins with inner transformation. Father Zosima, the spiritual elder in the Brothers Karamazov, says, "Each person is guilty for everyone and everything, not as some absurd condemnation, but as a radical invitation to personal responsibility. If evil starts in the heart, then healing must begin there too. But if evil is born in the heart, so is good." Dostoevsky is not a pessimist. He doesn't believe humans are hopelessly corrupt. Quite the opposite. He believes that holiness is possible, even in the darkest places, even in the most broken souls. It's in simple gestures, quiet moments, and acts of mercy that this holiness reveals itself, often without glory, without applause, without recognition. The woman who forgives, the man who confesses his guilt, the young person who chooses not to take revenge, the murderer who breaks down in tears and decides to start again. That, to Dostoevsky, is holiness. Not perfect, but real. His faith is in the possibility of transformation, not perfection. He believes the human heart can be illuminated, but never without struggle, never without pain. A central theme in Dostoevsky's work is moral conscience. Not an external rule book, but an inner voice that convicts, disturbs, and awakens. Conscience is that sacred space where good and evil clash, and where no one escapes self-judgment. Take Raskolnikov again. He tries to justify his crime with cold logic. The old pawnbroker was useless. Her death would benefit others. But something inside him won't be quiet. Guilt haunts him. Conscience isn't persuaded by logic. It speaks the language of the heart. And it's this voice of conscience that keeps the hope of holiness alive. Even the vilest person, if they truly listen to that inner voice, can change direction. That, to Dostoevsky, is the true courtroom. Not societies, not the legal systems, but the souls. And it is mercilessly honest. This tension between good and evil, far from being just a burden, is also the very ground of human freedom. We can only choose good because we're capable of choosing evil. There's no moral virtue without the possibility of failure. Dostoevsky rejects determinism. He doesn't see humans as machines of instinct or products of society. To him, we are free, and because we are free, we are responsible. Duality isn't a flaw, it's the stage where choice happens. Every human being carries within them a universe, and that universe can reach from hell to salvation. The soul is a battlefield, but also a garden with potential, and it's freedom that gives us the power to plant or destroy. In the modern world, the idea of evil is often emptied of meaning. It's turned into a diagnosis, a dysfunction, a mistake. But Dostoevsky brings evil back as a moral decision, a conscious choice against good. Evil that hides under logic, under progress, under science. But in the end, it's still the destruction of others and of the self. At the same time, he reveals quiet goodness, the kind that doesn't appear in speeches but in hidden actions, everyday kindness, forgiveness with no audience, a tear in prayer, a coin given in silence and shame. These to him are true miracles, because real holiness, like real evil, doesn't need a stage. Both are born from the same place, the human heart. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we become saints, but he demands that we be honest, and that honesty begins with recognizing our own duality. We're not pure, we're not whole. We have shadows, selfish desires, violent impulses, but we also have love, compassion, hope. Acknowledging this inner split is the first step. It's when we stop judging others as the bad ones and start looking inward. It's when we realize the battlefield isn't out there. It's right here, in the heart. And if the battle is internal, then so is hope. Because where there is conflict, there is still life. Where there is doubt, there is still searching. Where there is a fall, there can still be redemption. I'm a sick man, a wicked man. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground. With this brutal confession, the narrator of Notes from Underground pulls us into a torn, self-consuming, uncomfortable mind. There is no hero here, no redemption, no glory. Only a man who thinks and gets sick from overthinking, who feels but refuses to surrender to his emotions, who desires and sabotages his own desires. This is the underground man, radical subjectivity, suffocated by its own lucidity. Dostoevsky wrote this text in 1864 as a direct response to the modern belief that human beings are fully rational, predictable, and improvable through science, education, or social structures. It was the age of positivism, utopian socialism, and faith in progress. But Dostoevsky saw something deeper, chaos within the human soul. And that's what he delivers, raw and unfiltered, in this explosive monologue. The underground isn't a physical space. It's a metaphor for hyper-reflective consciousness. The narrator lives there, not because of lack of opportunity, but because of rejection. He watches everything from a distance, with sarcasm and scorn. But what seems like arrogance is actually defense. He's terrified of other people, terrified of being rejected, terrified of being loved. This underground is where reason turns against itself, where a person feels too much, thinks too much, and ends up frozen. He doesn't act, and when he does, he self-destructs. He knows what would be good and chooses the opposite, just to prove he's free. He refuses to be reduced to an equation. Dostoevsky is at war with the idea that human beings are rational animals. The underground man is an extreme, and therefore truthful, caricature of the collapse of that ideal. He says with bitter irony, 2 + 2 is 4. Fine. But sometimes man wants 2 + 2 to equal 5. That statement isn't just irrational, it's anti-rational. It's an existential protest against the attempt to domesticate the human soul with formulas, statistics, and systems. The narrator doesn't want to be saved by a perfect society. He wants to preserve his irrational essence, even if it destroys him. Because, to Dostoevsky, There's something in the human soul that resists being reduced. There's a core of freedom that would rather suffer than be tamed. People don't just want comfort, they want meaning. And meaning isn't always logical. The underground man is, above all, free. But his freedom doesn't lead to creativity, it leads to destruction. He sabotages his own happiness. He refuses love. He mocks others. When he has a chance to get close to Liza, a young prostitute who represents a chance at redemption, he humiliates her, then regrets it. But it's already too late. Why? Because to him, freedom is negative. It's the power to say no. It's the scream of someone who refuses to be tamed, even if it means living in the sewer of his own soul. This tragic freedom is a central theme in Dostoevsky's work. He sees it as sacred, but also dangerous. A free man can rise to great heights, but he can also destroy himself. And sometimes, self-destruction is his only proof that he's truly free. The underground man is painfully self-aware, but that awareness paralyzes him. He sees his own contradictions, society's hypocrisies, the lies of progress, but he can't love, and he can't be loved. He's trapped inside his own mind, a mind that never shuts off, that analyzes everything, that corrodes everything. He's too conscious to live and too unconscious to change. Reason, which should bring clarity, becomes a maze. The underground is that overloaded awareness that refuses to act, out of fear of failure, of pain, of rejection. Dostoevsky shows us that subjectivity, when disconnected from others, becomes sick. Man was not made to live only inside his thoughts. Excessive introspection, without openness to others, turns into neurosis, guilt, and self-sabotage. The most tragic part? The underground man doesn't want to be saved. Or rather, he wants salvation, but he can't accept it. He sees in Liza a chance for love, for reconciliation with life. But when she reaches out, he bites her hand, because love demands vulnerability, and he prefers to stay in control. That refusal is the core of his misery. He's proud of his intelligence, but he can't feel joy. His reason is both his armor and his prison. He knows the way to the light, but chooses the shadows, just to prove that no one can force him to be happy. This is the darkest side of human subjectivity, the desire for absolute freedom, even at the cost of rejecting what is good, just to stay in control. Dostoevsky wrote Notes from Underground in the 19th century, but the underground man could easily live today, in a world flooded with information, where everything is analyzed, interpreted, deconstructed. Too much awareness is still a burden. Today, many people live in the underground of the mind, hyper-connected, yet lonely, thinking constantly, but afraid to act, hiding behind masks, sabotaging relationships, doubting their own worth. The underground man is a symbol of subjectivity without faith, without transcendence, without surrender. He's the human being who no longer wants to be part of anything larger than himself. And because of that, he shrinks until he disappears. And yet, there's still a spark of humanity in him. Even in his misery, he recognizes his condition. He knows he's sick. He admits, "I'm a wicked man." He doesn't justify his actions. He doesn't blame society. He looks at himself and doesn't like what he sees. That brutal honesty is paradoxically a sign of hope, because someone who recognizes the abyss within still has a chance to be saved. The real danger lies in denial, in the refusal to see the evil inside. The underground man at least sees it, and that's already the beginning of something new. Dostoevsky offers no easy cure. He doesn't save his character, but he forces us to look inward and ask, how many underground men live inside us? How often do we rationalize our coldness, our fear, our pride? And if we can recognize them, maybe we can finally choose a different path. Christ is the truth, and if the truth were outside of Christ, I would still choose to stay with Christ. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Letter to von Wiesin, 1854. When Dostoevsky wrote these words, he wasn't making a formal theological statement, nor was he promoting institutional Christianity. He was revealing something far more personal, a visceral, lived faith, born from the depths of human experience, a faith that stands firm against rationalism, dogmatism, and skepticism, and that finds its anchor in a living person, Christ. For Dostoevsky, Christ is not just the center of religion. He is the absolute ethical ideal, the embodiment of the truth humanity longs for but cannot reach alone. And even if, in some hypothetical scenario, truth were found elsewhere outside of Christ, he would still choose Christ. Because in his view, Christ is not only true, he is more human than abstract truth itself. Dostoevsky's faith doesn't come from comfort, it comes from pain. He wrote this letter after his exile in Siberia, where he spent 4 years in a labor camp. There, in the cold, the hunger, and in the company of murderers and thieves, Christ became more real to him than any doctrine. Not a concept, but a presence. Not just a belief, but an experience. Dostoevsky's Christianity isn't built on academic theology. It's rooted in human suffering, in the search for meaning, in the inner struggle against evil. Christ is the one who descends to the depths of human misery and remains there beside us, even in our worst condition. He is harsh with religious systems that imprison faith within rules, hierarchies, or spiritual authoritarianism. This becomes clear in the Grand Inquisitor episode in The Brothers Karamazov. In the story, Jesus returns to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and is immediately arrested by the Church. The Inquisitor confronts him, saying, "You gave us freedom, but man doesn't want freedom. He wants bread, and we corrected your mistake." Christ remains silent throughout, and at the end, responds only with a kiss. This scene is a powerful critique of religious power that twists the gospel to control the masses. The Inquisitor represents corrupted Christianity, the kind that chooses power over mercy, doctrine over compassion, stability over the risk of love. Christ, on the other hand, represents a truth that does not impose, but offers. That does not dominate, but heals. That cannot be proven by arguments, but is revealed through presence. To Dostoevsky, Christ is not a distant, majestic God, untouched by pain. He is the God who bleeds with humanity, who suffers injustice, who shares in our sorrow, who forgives even when the world condemns him. This Christ, fully human, fully divine, is, to Dostoevsky, the highest ethical model the world has ever seen. When Father Zosima, the spiritual elder in the Brothers Karamazov, speaks of Christ, he does so with tenderness and reverence, not as a dogma, but as a living presence. And when Alyosha, his disciple, tries to live according to Christ's example, he does it not with moralism, but with compassion. In all these characters, Christ is a call to holiness born out of love, not obligation. The beauty of this Christ is that he does not demand perfection, he asks for surrender. He knows humanity's weakness, but believes in its redemption. And that's why Dostoevsky says, even if truth were found elsewhere, he would still choose Christ, because Christ is the only truth that loves humanity fully, flaws and all. When Dostoevsky says he would choose Christ over truth, even if truth stood elsewhere, he's making a deeply philosophical point. Truth cannot be separated from life. Truth, when reduced to abstract ideas, can become cold, cruel, inhuman. How many crimes, how many wars, how many authoritarian regimes have been justified in the name of truth? Christ, on the other hand, represents a truth that is embodied, a truth that loves, forgives, and sacrifices itself, a truth that kneels beside the sinner, that looks the prostitute in the eye, that does not reject the broken. That's the truth Dostoevsky longs for, not one that convinces the mind, but one that transforms the heart. For Dostoevsky, believing in Christ is not just a religious conviction, it's a moral decision. It's choosing the path of love, mercy, and compassion, even when the world offers the opposite. Christ is the model of a human being, reconciled with himself and with others. He is the opposite of pride, cruelty, and indifference. To believe in Christ is to say, I choose to love, I choose to forgive, I choose not to return evil with evil. This kind of faith doesn't require absolute certainty, it requires faithfulness. It's a faith that wavers, that doubts, that suffers, but endures, because it's not based on argument, but on relationship. And relationship is always stronger than logic. Dostoevsky sees nihilism as the great threat of modernity. The loss of faith, the collapse of values, the normalization of evil, all of it pushing humanity into emptiness, despair, and violence. Atheism, in its radical form, may offer freedom, but often a freedom without direction, without ethics, without meaning, a freedom that leaves the human being drowning in himself. Christ, to Dostoevsky, is the existential answer to nihilism. He is not the negation of freedom, but its redemption. He offers a sense of purpose that does not erase suffering, but illuminates it. A love that doesn't deny pain, but transforms it into compassion. In a world where everything feels relative, where morality is fractured, where truth is subjective, Christ remains the one figure who stands as a symbol of absolute moral integrity. And for that reason, he remains the hope, even for those who feel like they can't believe anymore. In the end, Dostoevsky's faith is a choice of the heart. He knew doubt, he lived through darkness, he felt the absence of God, and still, he chose Christ, not out of logic, but out of love. And that's what makes his faith so moving. It's not easy, it's not immune to suffering, but it's deeply human. For Dostoevsky, Christ isn't a dogma to be accepted. He is a presence to be welcomed, a truth that doesn't force itself, but waits patiently for the moment when the heart is ready to love. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground. In a world obsessed with eliminating pain, avoiding discomfort, and silencing anything unpleasant, Dostoevsky goes in the opposite direction. He states, with brutal honesty, that it is through suffering that we recognize our humanity. Only when we are wounded, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, does consciousness awaken, opening the door to truth, transformation, and depth. This is not a glorification of suffering as torture or punishment. It's not an invitation to spiritual masochism either. It is a deeply human understanding that suffering is an inevitable and formative part of authentic existence. Instead of running from it, Dostoevsky invites us to go through it, because it is in that passage that we become aware of who we truly are. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. This sentence isn't meant as an absolute formula, but as an existential challenge. Dostoevsky knew that comfort can numb the soul, that stability can create the illusion of fulfillment. But when everything collapses, when we face death, loss, injustice, deep pain, something inside us wakes up. It's in those moments that we ask, why? What for? Who am I in the face of this? These questions don't come from comfort, they come from fracture. In that sense, suffering is not the enemy of spiritual life. It is the beginning, it is the doorway. In Notes from Underground, the narrator is a man in constant conflict with himself, sick, bitter, painfully self-aware. He suffers not just physically, but existentially. And it is through that suffering that his consciousness reaches the point of seeing himself with all his cruelty and complexity. Suffering forces him to see himself, with no masks, no excuses. Dostoevsky knew pain has the power to destroy, but also to reveal. It exposes the ego, it breaks illusions, it forces us to confront our mortality, our guilt, our loneliness. Pain reveals what pride hides. That's why suffering in Dostoevsky's novels is never peripheral. It is central. It's not a plot device. It is the very stage where the human soul unfolds. His most profound characters, Raskolnikov, Dmitri, Ivan, the underground man, all go through the dark night of the soul, and it is this darkness that makes them real, human, and moving. To Dostoevsky, pain doesn't destroy the human being, it reveals them. Who we really are often only shows itself when everything we depended on is taken away. And in that emptiness, that groundless place, something new can begin. But Dostoevsky doesn't stop at consciousness. To him, suffering not only awakens, it redeems. Pain, when accepted, becomes a tool for inner purification, ethical transformation, and spiritual renewal. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov commits murder, convinced he's above common morality. But the crime eats him from the inside. Guilt corrodes him. He tries to justify it rationally. But the moral suffering doesn't let go. Only when he accepts his pain, when he surrenders, when he allows himself to be humbled, can he begin again. Redemption, for Dostoevsky, is not about forgetting guilt. It's about living through guilt to the end. It's suffering embraced, not as punishment, but as a possibility for healing. Suffering, then, has a spiritual function. It prepares the soul for conversion. But Dostoevsky also explores a far deeper and more painful dimension of suffering, the suffering of the innocent. Ivan Karamazov, in The Brothers Karamazov, recounts stories of children who were tortured, humiliated, and killed unjustly. And in response, he says he refuses to accept a world where such pain is the price for universal harmony. Not even the promise of future salvation justifies such suffering. Ivan's rejection is a legitimate moral revolt, and Dostoevsky doesn't answer it with logic. He answers it with the image of Christ, a Christ who also suffered innocently, who shared in the pain of the innocent, who did not explain suffering but took it on, who didn't erase it but sanctified it through his presence. Christ, in Dostoevsky's vision, is the silent response to the problem of evil, not a solution that erases pain, but a path that transforms it. If God himself suffered, then human suffering is not abandonment, it is communion. Dostoevsky never romanticizes suffering, but he sees it as a kind of spiritual pedagogy, not the only way to grow, but the most radical, inevitable, and true. He writes from personal experience. His years in prison, exile, illness, the early deaths of loved ones, all of it shaped him, wounded him, and formed him as both a writer and a man of faith. In his view, pain shouldn't be avoided at all costs. It should be faced with awareness, humility, and courage, because only those who suffer can truly understand the suffering of others, and only those who understand can truly love. In that way, suffering stops being just a passive experience and becomes a path of empathy, compassion, and solidarity. But none of this is automatic. Suffering by itself doesn't save anyone. It can destroy us or transform us. It depends on how we face it. Dostoevsky shows that suffering can lead to resentment, rebellion, and isolation, but it can also lead to humility, openness, and faith. It is an inner choice. Pain presents the truth, but we decide what to do with it. Those who refuse to suffer, who numb themselves, often end up trapped in a life that's shallow, cynical, disconnected. Those who accept pain, not as defeat, but as passage, discover a dimension of life that goes beyond logic, pleasure, and reason. Ultimately, Dostoevsky sees suffering as a doorway to the sacred. It is in pain that we discover we are not self-sufficient, that we need others, that we need God, that we need meaning, not just comfort. Suffering, then, is not the end of spiritual life. It is the beginning. It is where the soul becomes transparent, where pride is broken, where truth appears, and where, sometimes, God whispers the loudest. Man likes to make roads and to create, that is a fact beyond dispute. But why does he also passionately love destruction and chaos? Fyodor Dostoevsky notes from Underground. Why does a human being, even when faced with good, choose evil? Why, when offered order, seek chaos? Why, with the path to light in front of him, does he so often dive willingly into darkness? These questions are at the heart of Dostoevsky's philosophy, and they go beyond psychological or moral speculation. They are existential questions, revealing something fundamental and often ignored: the irrational nature of human freedom. Unlike modern views that reduce human behavior to self-interest, evolutionary instinct, or rational calculation, Dostoevsky insists there is something deeper within us, unpredictable, mysterious, a kind of freedom that doesn't submit to systems, logic, or even common sense. This is what Dostoevsky calls irrational free will, a force that can give birth to both sublime beauty and total destruction. A freedom capable of love, creation, transcendence, but also of chaos, hatred, and self-sabotage. In the 19th century, when Dostoevsky was writing, many intellectuals believed that human behavior could be entirely understood and predicted through laws: economic, psychological, or social. Rationalism, scientism, and utopian socialism all promised a future where, by understanding the laws of human nature, we could build a perfect society. To Dostoevsky, that was a deadly illusion. He saw that any closed system, no matter how logical, ignores something essential about the human soul: our ability to reject what's obvious, to sabotage our own happiness, to deliberately choose the opposite, just to prove we're not machines. The narrator of Notes from Underground embodies this rebellion. He refuses to be just another brick in the wall of reason. He asserts, with irony and pain, that man would rather act against his own interests than be reduced to a formula. Dostoevsky isn't blind to the good we can do. He acknowledges our ability to create, to love, to grow. But he also recognizes, with brutal clarity, our strange attraction to destruction. Not just external destruction, but internal chaos, a deep, often unconscious desire to disrupt order, to break stability, to tear down what's working. This drive isn't always logical or explained. Sometimes it shows up as a strange rage, a refusal to cooperate, a visceral rejection of peace. It's a kind of freedom that refuses predictability, a freedom that would rather suffer than obey. That's the root of what Dostoevsky calls irrational free will, a freedom that doesn't choose good for logical reasons, and that's even capable of choosing evil, just to affirm autonomy. For Dostoevsky, the issue isn't that people make mistakes. The issue is that we often act against ourselves with full awareness. We know what's right, and we choose the opposite anyway. Why? Because reason doesn't rule us. Willpower, this deep, inexplicable drive, has the final say. And unlike machines, human will doesn't just seek efficiency. It seeks meaning. It seeks affirmation. Freedom, to a human being, is more valuable than happiness. And if everything has to be burned down to preserve it, so be it. That's why Dostoevsky mocks the idea of fixing humans through sociology or morality. We are not problems to be solved. We are mysteries to be faced. And that includes the terrifying power to destroy ourselves, just to prove we can. Dostoevsky saw free will as something sacred, but also something tragic. Freedom is what makes us human, but it's also what brings us close to the edge. Through freedom, we can love, but also betray. We can forgive, but also kill. We can build bridges, or blow up the foundations of civilization. This kind of freedom isn't just about choosing A or B. It's the ability to step outside of all predefined logic, and that makes it dangerous. Modern civilization, in its quest to eliminate suffering, pain, and uncertainty, also tries to eliminate this radical kind of freedom. We create a world where everything is explained, predicted, and controlled. But for Dostoevsky, this leads to disaster. Because when you strip humans of their irrational side, you don't make them better. You make them hollow. You turn them into soulless gears in a machine. In the end, Dostoevsky doesn't celebrate destruction. He just acknowledges its temptation. Chaos seduces us because it offers the illusion of total freedom. But that's exactly what it is, an illusion. Destruction doesn't liberate. it deforms. True freedom, in Dostoevsky's view, doesn't lie in breaking everything apart. It lies in choosing with awareness, in recognizing the chaos inside, and still choosing what's good. That is the highest act of freedom. Not blind rebellion, but conscious redemption. Still, Dostoevsky knows not everyone will make that choice. Many, when faced with the chance to be truly free, will choose voluntary slavery instead, to pride, to hatred, to the urge to destroy. The question he leaves us with is this: why do we love chaos, even when it destroys us? Maybe because it gives us a false sense of control. Maybe because it breaks the boredom. Or maybe, deep down, we're afraid of the silence that comes with order. A silence that forces us to look inward. Instead of denying this irrationality, Dostoevsky embraces it as part of the human condition. To him, we are not just rational or emotional. We are beings in constant tension, full of contradictions. And those contradictions aren't flaws, they are essential. Irrational free will is one of those contradictions. It shows we are not programmable. That human freedom can't be reduced to formulas. That goodness, to be real, must be chosen even when evil feels easier. And that evil, to be overcome, must be faced within, not just fought on the outside. There is no one more responsible for the evil in the world than myself. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers, Karamazov. Few sentences carry such a powerful ethical weight as this one. It doesn't point fingers. It doesn't shift the blame. It doesn't hide behind excuses or moral relativism. Quite the opposite. It takes full moral responsibility for the evil in the world, not as an exaggeration, but as a principle for inner transformation. In Dostoevsky's philosophical and literary universe, this idea is central. The regeneration of the world begins within the soul of the individual. Evil is not just something that comes from outside, nor is it an abstract problem to be solved through theories or systems. Evil lives in us, and it will only be defeated when each person recognizes themselves as part of it. The line above is spoken by Alyosha Karamazov, the most spiritual character in the novel, a disciple of the elder Zosima. But it's not about moral self-loathing or a pathological guilt complex. It's about a deeply internalized ethic, where the individual doesn't place themselves above others, but sees themselves as equally responsible for the human condition. To say, "I am guilty," is not to say that others are innocent. It's to say that responsibility can't be reduced to isolated facts, crimes, or injustices. Injustice exists because there's a world that allows it, and I am part of that world. If there is evil around me, then in some way I contribute to it, whether through omission, indifference, pride, or cowardice. This kind of philosophy takes courage, because it requires giving up the constant self-defense. It means looking at evil not just as an outside threat, but as a real possibility within, and at times, an active force. Dostoevsky is deeply critical of the human tendency to judge others harshly while being overly lenient with oneself. In his novels, the characters who see themselves as good, decent, or morally upright in the eyes of society are often the coldest, the most hypocritical, the least capable of love. Alyosha's posture is the opposite. It is humble. He doesn't need to be seen as righteous. He knows that true justice begins with recognizing the evil within. Not the dramatic or criminal kind, but the everyday evil: contempt, quiet resentment, subtle lies, selfishness disguised as virtue. When Alyosha takes on guilt, he doesn't erase the guilt of others, but he creates an ethical space where forgiveness, dialogue, and healing become possible. Because only when someone acknowledges their own darkness can they reach out to others without arrogance. The elder Zosima, Alyosha's spiritual teacher, best embodies this philosophy of universal guilt. He teaches that each person must consider themselves responsible for all the sins of the world, not as a metaphor, but as a lived reality. Zosima believed the world would only be saved when people stopped blaming and started owning. that the suffering of another person is also my responsibility. That injustice committed by a stranger is not irrelevant to me. That the pain in the world somehow passes through my silence. This kind of awareness is rare. It requires a deep inner shift, where the main question is no longer who's right, but rather, what can I do to make evil less present in the world? When Zosima dies, he leaves behind a legacy of humility and empathy. He didn't fight evil with moralistic preaching, but with a gaze of compassion born from the awareness of his own guilt. The modern world, obsessed with blaming others, politics, parents, society, opposing groups, often loses its capacity for real change. Because as long as the guilt is always out there can be no true responsibility within. Dostoevsky offers the opposite, bringing guilt inward, not as a form of oppression, but as an opening. When I admit that I am part of the problem, I stop seeing others as enemies. I begin to see them as people suffering from the same human condition. Guilt then becomes a bridge, not a wall. This awareness holds immense ethical power, because only those who admit their own moral failure are truly capable of forgiving, and only those who forgive are capable of setting others free. Forgiveness is born from assumed guilt, not from vengeful justice. It's important to note, Dostoevsky isn't defending a guilt that paralyzes or destroys. For him, guilt isn't the end. It's the beginning. It's the moment from which transformation becomes possible. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, is a clear example. He commits murder believing he's above morality. But guilt devours him. And that guilt doesn't destroy him. It forces him to descend to the depths of human misery. And there, he finds a new path for his existence. Guilt leads him to humility, and humility leads him to redemption. The same happens with Dmitry Karamazov, who, even though he's innocent of patricide, accepts his existential guilt. He admits he was a disloyal son, a prideful brother, a volatile man, and in that recognition, he becomes more than he was. Truth lifts him, not because he denies the evil within, but because he confesses it sincerely. Dostoevsky is not proposing a morality of blind submission or self-erasure, quite the opposite. He's proposing a morality of the self, but a self that is responsible, lucid and compassionate. A self that doesn't seek power but redemption, that doesn't dominate but serves, that doesn't take revenge but seeks reconciliation. This is the kind of ethic he offers as a path to healing in a divided, aggressive, polarized world. A world where everyone screams but few listen, where everyone accuses but almost no one takes responsibility. In the phrase, "There is no one more responsible for the evil in the world than myself," Dostoevsky offers the opposite of today's victimhood culture. He offers a culture of inner responsibility. And it's from this place, where a person stops pointing fingers and starts looking inward, that a new kind of humanity might be born. A humanity that is less arrogant, less violent, less broken. Love is an infinite education. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. For Dostoevsky, love is not just a fleeting emotion or romantic feeling. Above all, it's a spiritual and ethical experience, an existential call to transformation. Love is what makes a human being worthy of their own humanity. And not just any kind of love, but love in its highest form. Agape. Christian love, unconditional and sacrificial. The phrase, "love is an infinite education," reveals how deeply Dostoevsky understood love. He didn't see it as something natural or instinctive, but as a path of inner formation, a continuous, painful, enlightening process. To love is to learn, and that learning never ends. In the world of the brothers Karamazov, love isn't just an abstract idea. It takes shape in gestures, choices, conflicts, and sacrifices. The elder Zosima, spiritual mentor to Alyosha, teaches that to love is the most important and most difficult task of human life. To love is not simply to feel affection for someone. It's to recognize the other as a sacred mystery. It's to carry their pain as if it were your own. It's to let go of ego in order to enter into communion. It's to forgive before judging, to listen before correcting, to understand before reacting. This kind of love is above any utilitarian logic. You don't love because it gets results. You love because love itself is the meaning of existence. And those who truly love know, love teaches. It teaches patience, humility, sacrifice, generosity. It teaches you how to lose and still go on. Dostoevsky is merciless with sentimental, theoretical, idealized love. He calls it love for humanity, a kind of abstract love that often hides a deep contempt for real individual people. In The Brothers Karamazov, one character even says, "The more I love humanity in general, the less I love people in particular." This distant, impersonal, philanthropic love isn't real love. It's an empty speech that allows someone to feel morally superior while avoiding the real, gritty work of loving those closest to them, with all their flaws, weaknesses, and contradictions. For Dostoevsky, true love is concrete. It's loving the difficult father, the violent brother, the dirty poor man, the repentant criminal, the sick child. It's in this real ground, marked by human imperfection, that love becomes authentic. And that's why it's an infinite education, because every new encounter, every new wound, every new fall forces us to relearn how to love. To love, for Dostoevsky, is the movement that breaks the isolation of the ego. It's the antidote to pride, vanity, and spiritual narcissism. It's stepping outside yourself to recognize the other, not as an obstacle, but as a path. That's why love hurts. It demands that we let go, open up, become vulnerable. To love is to risk being wounded. It offers no guarantees. It means giving your heart without knowing if it'll be returned. And still, you choose to love. Because love doesn't need reciprocity to be true. In this sense, Christian love, agape, is the most demanding of all. It doesn't love only those who deserve it. It loves the enemy, the ungrateful, the sinner. It expects nothing in return. It doesn't demand perfection. It loves because it sees in the other the image of God. Christ, in Dostoevsky's vision, is not just an object of faith. He is the model of humanity, the Christ who forgives the adulterous woman, who weeps with Mary at Lazarus's tomb, who embraces the repentant thief on the cross. This is the Christ of absolute love. And this is the love we're called to live. But how can we love like this in a world full of violence, betrayal, and selfishness? Dostoevsky doesn't give us formulas. He gives us characters, men and women who fail, who suffer, who fall, but who still choose to love. Alyosha Karamazov is an example of this lived-out love. He isn't perfect, but he is kind, compassionate, present. He doesn't judge. He welcomes. He listens. And this quiet, loving presence transforms those around him. In the face of evil, there are always two possible responses: hatred or love. Hatred feeds the cycle of violence. Love breaks it. But to love in the face of evil is one of the hardest things, because it feels unfair, weak, pointless. Dostoevsky insists, though, only love redeems. Love doesn't justify evil, but it disarms it. It doesn't follow the logic of revenge, punishment, or exclusion. It embraces the sinner without condoning the sin. It restores without humiliating. That's the radical message of the gospel. And also the radical message of Dostoevsky: to love as Christ loved. Not with words, but with actions. Not with doctrines, but with compassion. To love to the very end. To love when it's hardest. To love when it feels impossible. That's why love is an infinite education, because we're never fully ready to love. There's always more to learn, more to forgive, more to give. Love is a school where life is the teacher, and the exams are our daily choices: to listen or to ignore, to forgive or to punish, to welcome or to judge. Every person who crosses our path becomes an opportunity to practice love. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed. But the important thing is to keep learning. Love isn't a skill you master. It's a posture you renew moment by moment. In Dostoevsky, love is both a commandment and a miracle. A commandment because it's an undeniable ethical duty. Without love, nothing has value. But also a miracle because to truly love doesn't come only from willpower, but from grace. That's why love demands humility. No one loves alone. No one loves perfectly. Love is always a gift, received and shared. And that's why it transforms us, because it removes us from the center and places us before the other as learners, not as masters. Eternal life exists, and you exist, and I exist, and beauty exists. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Idiot. This line, spoken by one of Dostoevsky's most spiritual and enigmatic characters, Prince Mishkin, is not a dogmatic claim. It's a declaration of faith in the face of the abyss. It's a poetic, almost desperate response to nihilism, hopelessness, and the idea that everything ends in nothing. To say that eternal life exists is to affirm, with all one's heart, that existence holds a meaning that goes beyond death and absurdity. For Dostoevsky, belief in the immortality of the soul isn't just a religious matter. It's the backbone of moral, spiritual, and existential life. He understood that if the soul doesn't continue after death, then good and evil lose their meaning. Virtue becomes hollow, and beauty turns into a fleeting luxury. Immortality is what anchors human dignity in something indestructible, even by death. Dostoevsky was deeply disturbed by the rise of modern skepticism and the slow erosion of traditional beliefs. He saw that as faith in the soul's immortality faded, so did the sense of objective meaning in life. Morality became relative, suffering purposeless. Life, a chain of disconnected moments heading toward final oblivion. This crisis appears in The Brothers Karamazov, when Ivan says, "If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted." And along with God, the hope for immortality dies too. What's left is nihilism, the sense that nothing ultimately matters. And in the face of that, the human being is left alone, trapped in the cold logic of matter, tormented by a restless mind searching for meaning. For Dostoevsky, it's not enough to simply live. You have to know why you're living. And that question doesn't have a full answer without the idea of eternity. If everything ends at death, what justifies pain? What makes sacrifice worthwhile? What gives meaning to a love that spans generations? Morality, in Dostoevsky's view, is not utilitarian or purely social. It's a calling toward holiness, justice, and mercy. But that calling only has real power if the soul transcends time and the body. For virtue to be genuine, it must still matter, even when there's no reward. It must be good even when no one's watching. And that requires a spiritual dimension, a silent eternity that gives weight to our actions. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin embodies this kind of holiness. He loves without expecting anything in return. He forgives with sincerity. He shows compassion, even when people mock him. His goodness, often seen as naive, isn't calculated. It flows from deep faith. He believes goodness is real and that the soul is eternal. And that's why he doesn't need to win to be right. So belief in immortality is not about escaping reality. It's a commitment to it. Because someone who believes the soul lives on also believes every act, no matter how small, holds eternal value. Mishkin's line connects three things: your existence, the existence of others, and the existence of beauty, all grounded in the reality of eternal life. To Dostoevsky, beauty isn't just aesthetic, it's metaphysical. It's a sign that the world isn't just mechanical, but holds something mysterious, something that points toward the eternal. That's the same idea behind his most famous quote, "Beauty will save the world." But what kind of beauty? Not the surface level kind, but the beauty of the soul. The beauty of truth, compassion, forgiveness. The beauty that remains even in suffering. the beauty that comes from the purest form of love. And for Dostoevsky, that beauty is only possible because the soul exists, and because it doesn't die. So beauty isn't a luxury, it's a clue. A sign that there's something beyond flesh, beyond time, beyond pain. Something worth seeking. Dostoevsky knew death intimately. He was arrested, sentenced to execution, and pardoned just minutes before facing a firing squad. He spent years in Siberian labor camps. He lost children. He battled illness. He lived in poverty. He knew death wasn't abstract. It was always close. But it was through that closeness to the end that his deepest faith was born. The certainty that the soul does not die, that there is something within us that cannot be destroyed, and that this eternity isn't just far away. It begins here, now, in the choices we make, the love we give, and the truth we live. To believe in the soul's immortality is, for him, to believe that life is greater than death. And that changes everything. Because if death doesn't have the final word, then hope is possible, even in the darkest pain. Without the idea of immortality, we risk falling into the logic of absurdity, as later seen in thinkers like Camus and Sartre. Existence becomes an interval between two nothings, and in that interval, every gesture becomes ultimately pointless. No matter how hard we try to build values, find purpose, or fight for justice, if the soul dies too, then all of it disappears. Dostoevsky challenges this not with philosophical arguments or theology, but with characters, stories, and raw human drama. He shows that we crave eternity, that deep inside we long for the infinite, and that this longing is not a delusion, but a glimpse of truth. In the end, belief in the soul's immortality isn't just comfort, it's the foundation of a meaningful life. Because if the soul is eternal, then every action matters. Every choice shapes something infinite. Every human being carries a dignity that can't be reduced to function, usefulness, or appearance. To believe in the immortality of the soul is to believe that life has absolute value, that no one is disposable, that no suffering is meaningless, and that even what the world forgets, a quiet act of kindness, a hidden forgiveness, a lonely tear, has eternal weight. 2 + 2 = 4, that's the beginning of death. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground. Saying 2 + 2 = 4 seems like an unquestionable truth, a solid foundation of reason. But in Dostoevsky's hands, that mathematical certainty becomes something deeper and darker, a symbol of existential imprisonment. When he says 2 + 2 = 4 is the beginning of death, he's not rejecting logic or math itself. He's warning us about the danger of reducing human beings to an equation. In Notes from Underground, a work that anticipates much of 20th century existentialism, Dostoevsky delivers a radical critique of scientific rationalism, the belief that everything, including human beings, can be explained, predicted, and controlled through reason, science, and calculation. He saw that trying to systematize human life with mathematical precision kills something essential: freedom, subjectivity, mystery, pain, love. The narrator, the so-called underground man, is someone hyper-aware, who thinks too much and lives too little. He knows that 2 + 2 = 4, and that's exactly why he rebels against it. Not because it's wrong, but because it represents a cold, oppressive logic trying to replace the human soul with rigid formulas. In Dostoevsky's time, and honestly in ours too, he saw a growing obsession with measuring and quantifying life. The idea that with enough data, human behavior could be predicted like a machine. Scientific social theories, utilitarianism, technical socialism, they all aim to design perfect societies based on rational laws. But Dostoevsky warns us, the human soul doesn't fit into blueprints. Forcing it into rigid structures suffocates what's most vital: our freedom, our contradictions, our longing for the infinite. 2 + 2 = 4 represents the reign of necessity. It's a truth you can't escape. But for Dostoevsky, humans can't survive on necessity alone. We crave freedom, even if that freedom is destructive, irrational, painful. That's why, according to the narrator, people sometimes love chaos and destruction. In a world where everything is fully explained and determined, the only way to prove we're truly free is to reject logic, to act against what's reasonable. This is Dostoevsky's paradox. Human beings would rather suffer than be completely submitted to reason. Scientism, when it tries to domesticate human behavior, creates a predictable world, but it also becomes soulless. And in that kind of world, where everything makes sense, that's where death begins. The death of creativity, rebellion, faith, and selfless love. Dostoevsky doesn't hate science, reason, or technology. What he insists is this: human life is not a math problem. It can't be solved with equations. It can't be reduced to usefulness, efficiency, or predictability. The human heart is a paradoxical place. We can love those who hurt us. We can hate those who help us. We can forgive the unforgivable. We can choose what destroys us. None of this fits into any formula. That's why the underground man mocks the idea of a crystal palace, a symbol of the perfect, rational, unchanging utopia. He mocks it because he knows that a perfectly ordered world would be unbearable for the human soul. A world where everything is correct, logical, and functional, but where there's no space for mystery, for art, for faith, for redemptive failure. In other words, a world without humanity. Dostoevsky isn't rejecting reason. What he fights is the absolutization of reason, the belief that only what can be proven, measured, or quantified truly matters. That mindset cuts out fundamental parts of existence: the sacred, the intuitive, the spiritual, the tragic. Reason can explain how the world works, but not why it exists. It can predict natural events, but not why a person would choose to die for someone else. It can analyze collective behavior, but not the meaning behind a sincere tear, a selfless act, a forgiveness with no explanation. Dostoevsky saw that some truths can't be demonstrated, but are more real than any proven fact. And too much reason doesn't bring wisdom. It brings dehumanization. The soul, he believed, needs something beyond what logic can offer. One danger of scientific rationalism is that it often removes ethics in favor of efficiency. If the goal is to build the best possible society through social and economic calculations, then individual lives can be sacrificed for the sake of the system. Humans become numbers, variables in a machine. Here, Dostoevsky anticipates the horrors of 20th century totalitarian regimes, where the logic of progress justified oppression, genocide, and the erasure of individual freedom. Rational utopia, when cut off from compassion and human dignity, becomes a nightmare of technological tyranny. That's why the underground man's rebellion is also ethical and spiritual. He declares, "I'm free, and because I'm free, I can say 2 + 2 = 5. That sentence, absurd by logic's standards, is a cry of metaphysical freedom, a reminder that human beings are not algorithms. Dostoevsky didn't want to destroy reason. He wanted to place it beneath something higher. He wanted us to remember that reason, when it doesn't recognize its own limits, becomes blind. That science, without a soul, becomes cruel. That knowledge, without wisdom, becomes dangerous. True reason, for Dostoevsky, is humble in the face of mystery. It accepts that there's something in the human being that can't be decoded by experiments or tamed by theory. Something sacred, something free, something eternal. Atheism is despair. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Demons. This short but piercing sentence captures one of Dostoevsky's deepest beliefs. The idea that denying God isn't just an intellectual stance, it's a spiritual, existential, and moral crisis. For him, atheism is more than the absence of religion. It's a rupture between man and the absolute meaning of life, a rupture that doesn't lead to total freedom, but rather to emptiness, anxiety, and ultimately, despair. In Demons, also translated as The Possessed, a dark and prophetic novel, Dostoevsky portrays with brutal clarity the effects of modern nihilism, the void left behind where faith used to be. The character who says atheism is despair isn't a religious fanatic. He's someone who has seen up close what happens to a soul deprived of transcendence. In this story, disbelief isn't liberating. It's corrosive. It dissolves moral foundations, strips life of value, and turns freedom into an unbearable burden. Dostoevsky predicted, decades before Nietzsche, what would later be called the death of God. But unlike Nietzsche, who tried to make man the new God, Dostoevsky saw that death as the beginning of moral, spiritual, and existential collapse. If God doesn't exist, then there is no objective good or evil, no soul, no eternity, no ultimate purpose. What's left is a human being reduced to matter, to the moment, to biology, to chance. And for Dostoevsky, this isn't a neutral position. It doesn't just erase theology, it destroys morality. Without an absolute good, everything becomes a matter of usefulness, convenience, or brute force. Virtue disappears, guilt becomes obsolete, crime becomes a rational option. This collapse is lived intensely by Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov, when he declares, "If God doesn't exist, everything is permitted." This line isn't meant to provoke, it's a lament. Ivan realizes that without God, life loses its moral compass, and human reason, no matter how sophisticated, can't fill that void alone. Dostoevsky doesn't write against atheism as an ideology. He writes against what the denial of God does to the human soul. His view is existential, not dogmatic. He understood the emptiness that appears when faith disappears, not because he read about it, but because he lived it. As a young man, Dostoevsky flirted with atheist socialism and modern rationalism. But after being imprisoned and sent to Siberia, he found his faith again, not through theology, but through suffering and through living among society's outcasts. There, he saw that even the most broken people still carry within them a thirst for something beyond, a cry for God. To deny that thirst is to mutilate the soul. It's to accept a life amputated of meaning. And as much as atheism tries to present itself as liberation, what often remains is helplessness, cynicism, and despair. One of modernity's great myths is that rejecting God makes us more free. But Dostoevsky saw the exact opposite. The absence of God doesn't set us free. It disorients us. When there is no ultimate purpose, no absolute truth, no higher good, freedom becomes an empty form, and man, instead of becoming a creator, becomes a prisoner of his own impulses. That's what Dostoevsky masterfully portrays in Demons, through characters who try to build a new society based on reason and power alone. They preach freedom, but live in despair. They talk about progress, but end up embracing destruction. Because without God, everything is permitted, including the absurd. The result is tragic: murder, suicide, ideological delusions. A whirlwind of chaos where no life has intrinsic value. Man, stripped of the image of God, becomes disposable, even to himself. For Dostoevsky, to deny God is also to deny the sacredness of the other. Your neighbor is no longer seen as the image of God, just a body, a role, an obstacle, or a means to an end. Without God, otherness is lost. Love becomes desire. Compassion becomes calculation. Justice becomes revenge. That's why the most atheistic characters in Dostoevsky's novels struggle to love. Not because they're evil by nature, but because they've lost the foundation that makes the other worthy of unconditional love. Agape, Christian love, is only possible when we recognize something eternal and divine in the other person. Without that, ethics becomes fragile. Zosima, in The Brothers Karamazov, teaches that to love others is to love God within them. When that connection breaks, all that's left is moral utilitarianism, which always fails in the face of real suffering. In Dostoevsky's view, atheism isn't a logical problem, it's a problem of hope. He portrays the atheist as someone who is painfully aware of the world's suffering, but finds no promise beyond it. Suffering, without transcendence becomes unbearable. Injustice without redemption becomes absurd. Death without a soul becomes the final end. That's why atheism becomes a kind of lucid despair. Lucidity without faith is clarity that blinds. It sees the world as it truly is, but can't bear to live in it. Human reason, without God, can diagnose, but it can't console. It can explain, but not redeem. Despair is born from that kind of clarity without response. And that's why so many of Dostoevsky's characters end up destroying themselves. Not because they hate life, but because they can't bear to live without meaning. Dostoevsky doesn't offer a logical rebuttal to atheism. He offers an existential alternative, a life where faith isn't an escape, but an act of courage, where God isn't a concept, but a presence. Faith for Dostoevsky doesn't solve every mystery, but it sustains the soul in the face of them. It doesn't erase suffering, but it gives suffering a horizon. It doesn't guarantee certainty, but it offers hope. That's why, in the darkness of his novels, there is always at least one character who chooses to believe. Not because they have proof, but because they've realized that without God, the heart dies. Alyosha, Zosima, Prince Mishkin, they all live a faith that is embodied, a faith that loves, forgives, suffers, and endures. And in that endurance, they resist despair. Man is inclined to love humanity more than his neighbor. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers. Karamazov. Loving humanity is easy. Loving your neighbor, that's the hard part. This is the subtle yet devastating truth Dostoevsky throws at the human heart. Behind the noble appearance of those who claim to love all of humanity, he often sees disguised selfishness, a will to power masked by lofty ideals. It's not just a critique of abstract humanism, but also of the hypocrisy of a love that refuses to get its hands dirty with real people. That quote from the brothers Karamazov hits a nerve that runs through ethics, politics, and even spirituality. The tendency to idealize the collective, the people, society, mankind, while ignoring or even despising the actual individual in front of us, with all their weaknesses, contradictions, and inconvenient needs. Dostoevsky was a thinker grounded in flesh, sweat, and face-to-face reality. He knew that loving in the abstract is often a way to avoid real commitment. Saying I love humanity takes no effort, no sacrifice, no patience. It sounds noble, but it's hollow. Loving your neighbor, on the other hand, means being present. It means listening, tolerating, forgiving, enduring. It means dealing with the smell, the voice, the tears, and yes, the discomfort. When Dostoevsky critiques the love of humanity, he's not denying the value of universal love. He's questioning its authenticity when it becomes a cover for the inability to love a real person. There's something deeply existential about this. The truth of love is revealed not in abstract ideas, but in real existence. To love someone is to face their uniqueness, their freedom, their suffering, their differences. Dostoevsky's criticism of abstract humanism especially targets those who preach high ideals, justice, equality, progress, but who, in practice, won't look another person in the eye. For him, many who claim to love humanity actually can't stand people. What they really want is to control the world, to impose their vision, to shape the fate of others, all in the name of some greater good but without any concrete compassion. This kind of disembodied love easily turns into ideology. History is full of examples where the love of humanity justified crimes against individuals. The great tyrannies of the 20th century didn't fail for lack of ideals, but because of too many of them, applied without mercy, without listening, without respect for the singularity of each person. In this context, the will to power disguises itself as universal goodness. A person may feel morally superior because they fight for noble causes, but in daily life, they can't live with people who are different from them. They don't tolerate others' flaws, and they don't practice empathy. What looks like altruism is often self-affirmation in disguise. To love your neighbor, in both the Christian tradition and Dostoevsky's philosophy, is not a metaphor. It's a demand. And not for some ideal neighbor, but the real one, the annoying one, the unfair one, the dirty one, the contradictory one. Loving that person is the true test of moral authenticity. Starets Zosima, a character in The Brothers Karamazov, says, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. Loving in dreams, loving humanity, is easy, but love in action demands sacrifice, patience, and humility. It doesn't glorify us, it crucifies us. That's why true love is a form of education." As we saw in the previous lesson, love is an infinite education. And that education happens in daily contact with people who challenge us, frustrate us, break our sense of control. Love is always personal because it can only happen between unique, irreplaceable individuals. When Dostoevsky says that man tends to love humanity more than his neighbor, he's revealing a twisted truth. Idealism often hides selfishness. It's easier to love humanity because humanity asks nothing in return. Humanity doesn't point out our faults. It doesn't demand forgiveness. It doesn't confront us. Our neighbor does. Our neighbor exposes us. They force us to face our limits, our impatience, our pride. Loving your neighbor means dying a little every day to your ego, and that's unbearable for those who treat love as a way to feel good about themselves. That's why so many prefer grand speeches to simple acts. They'd rather save the world than help a neighbor. They prefer an idea of the common good over a hug at the right moment. And so, love becomes performance, and ethics becomes a show. Dostoevsky understood, more than most, the depth of what it means to truly encounter another person. He knew that the other is not an extension of ourselves, but an entire universe, with their own freedom, their own pain, their own story. To love, then, is not to project our expectations onto the other, but to welcome their otherness with reverence. This kind of love doesn't dominate, it listens. It doesn't try to convince, but to understand. It doesn't seek to control, but to serve. It's the opposite of the will to power. It's the will to presence. And it's in this kind of embodied love that Dostoevsky sees a way out of the selfishness that defines modern civilization. Not a generic love, but a love that kneels before the other. Not a theoretical love, but one that acts humbly, compassionately, without applause. Dostoevsky's quote is above all a mirror. It forces us to ask, do I love people or the image I have of them? Do I love the other, or do I love the feeling of being good? Am I truly loving, or just playing a role? These questions hurt, but they're necessary, because only through this pain can love be purified, can it become real. Only then can love stop being a tool of the ego and become a true response to someone else's suffering. Each of us is guilty before everyone and for everything. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. At first glance, this phrase sounds like an exaggeration, a kind of moralistic hyperbole. How could anyone be guilty for everyone and everything? What does it even mean to universalize guilt like that? In a world used to pinpointing blame, the criminal, the corrupt, the traitor, Dostoevsky proposes something radically different, a form of ethical awareness that isn't limited to the individual, but stretches to the collective, the spiritual, the existential. Each of us is guilty before everyone and for everything isn't about legal guilt. It's about radical moral responsibility. It's an ethical principle that says evil in the world isn't just the work of others, but also a consequence of my silence, my pride, my indifference, my inability to love. For Dostoevsky, guilt isn't a weight meant to paralyze you. On the contrary, it's a necessary starting point for any real transformation. True repentance isn't self-punishment, it's self-recognition. It's when a person stops justifying their actions and simply admits them. Instead of pointing the finger at others, they ask, "How did I contribute to this?" That's the spirit behind the words of Zosima, the wise monk who represents the highest form of spiritual consciousness in the Brothers Karamazov. For him, there is no redemption without the recognition of personal guilt. And this guilt isn't just for conscious acts, but also for what we fail to do. For every moment of apathy that adds to someone else's suffering. We live in a culture where it's common to see yourself as a victim of society, of others, of the system. And at the same time, we're quick to judge and condemn those around us. Dostoevsky breaks from both tendencies. To him, true liberation doesn't come from seeing yourself as a victim, nor from feeling morally superior. It comes from owning your share of responsibility for the world's brokenness. This idea sounds outrageous to modern ears. In a society that champions rights but avoids deep responsibility, taking on someone else's guilt sounds foolish. But Dostoevsky isn't talking about judicial guilt. He's talking about spiritual responsibility. Every small act of selfishness, every moment we stay silent in the face of injustice, every time we ignore someone else's pain, all of it keeps the machinery of evil running. This worldview has immense ethical power. Instead of waiting for the system or others to change, it insists that transformation starts within, and the doorway is repentance. To Dostoevsky, repentance isn't just a rational acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It's a deep spiritual movement. It's when the human heart softens, strips away its defenses, and realizes its smallness. And precisely because of that, becomes ready to receive something new. That something new is grace. The chance to begin again, to be forgiven, to reconcile with yourself, with others, and with God. But grace can only enter a heart that has repented. Pride is its greatest barrier. That's why Dostoevsky sees repentance not as weakness, but as the gateway to redemption. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov only finds redemption after immense inner torment, when he finally falls to his knees and confesses his crime. His repentance isn't just for killing someone, it's for believing he was above morality, above humanity. His guilt is the guilt of someone who tried to be God. His repentance is the act of becoming human again. To say that each of us is guilty before everyone and for everything is also to admit that our lives are deeply intertwined. We are not islands. What we do or don't do affects the world around us. Dostoevsky believed in a spiritual unity between all human beings, that even without realizing it, we constantly influence one another, that the evil of one corrupts the soul of many, and just as powerfully, the good of one can bring light to many. This awareness brings compassion, because when I see myself as guilty too, I no longer feel superior to others. I stop judging from a pedestal. I begin to see another person's misery as a reflection of my own. And that makes me more merciful, more patient, more human. Modern culture often sees guilt as toxic, something to avoid. But Dostoevsky flips that idea. Guilt, when it's true and honest, is sacred. Because only those who feel genuine guilt are ready to change. The absence of guilt, for him, is the most dangerous symptom of all. It's the hardened heart, numb, cold, and incapable of empathy. Of course, Dostoevsky warns that some guilt can be destructive, neurotic guilt that festers in silence, leading to self-punishment. But he also believes in another kind of guilt, the kind that's clear-eyed, conscious, transformative, the kind that sets people free, the kind that allows forgiveness, healing, and redemption. That is the guilt that saves. And that's why Dostoevsky elevates it as a spiritual virtue, not to shame people, but to heal them, not to bring them down, but to lift them up. And while repentance begins as something deeply personal, its effects ripple outward. A single repentant person can spark change in a family, a community, a society. Elder Zosima said, "Make yourself responsible for all people." That advice is revolutionary. It suggests that the world won't be saved from the top down, but from the inside out. By each person who, touched by repentance, decides to love more, forgive more, serve more. This radical responsibility might seem like a burden at first, but in truth, it sets us free. Because it moves us out of moral paralysis. It lifts us out of the role of passive spectator and turns us into active participants in the world's healing. In Dostoevsky's view, repentance is never the end. It's never a dead-end road. It's the first step toward love. Only those who admit they were wrong can love with humility. Only those who see themselves as sinners can forgive others. This humility is the soil where real love grows. It's where true compassion is born, not from a sense of superiority, but from a shared sense of fragility. To love after repentance is to love with clearer eyes, open hands, and a softer heart. Sometimes a smart man is forced to get drunk just to spend time with fools. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. At first glance, this quote might sound ironic, but it reveals one of the most unsettling aspects of Dostoevsky's thought. The idea that, in a disordered, absurd, and morally shattered world, true lucidity can look, or even become, madness. And inversely, what we often call normal might be nothing more than empty conformity, ethical numbness, or cowardly adaptation to chaos. In Dostoevsky's universe, the line between sanity and insanity is not fixed or objective. On the contrary, it's always porous, fluid, and tragic. Often, the person who sees things most clearly, the one with the deepest awareness, is also the most tormented, the most out of place, the least capable of living at peace with the world. Dostoevsky knew firsthand the weight of extreme consciousness. He was a man of sharp vision, deeply attuned to human suffering, moral contradictions, and the pain of the soul. And he understood that there's a kind of intelligence that doesn't bring comfort. It brings anguish. The lucid person is the one who can't numb themselves. They see through the lies of social conventions, the cynicism of institutions, the hypocrisy in relationships. They sense the abyss where others pretend to see solid ground. And what's left for such a person? Often, escape. Alcohol, as mentioned in the quote, becomes a metaphor for any kind of avoidance, from drinking to isolation, alienation to outright madness. Because living among fools, that is, among banality, lies, and emptiness, comes at a high cost for those with an awakened conscience. This anguish is central to Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov, the protagonist, isn't just an unstable man. He's brilliant, intelligent, idealistic. He commits a murder not out of greed, but to test a philosophical idea, that extraordinary individuals stand above morality. But that idea, though seemingly logical, crashes against his conscience. And that conscience, sharp as a blade, begins to destroy him from within. Raskolnikov's madness is, in a way, a form of lucidity. He sees, with unbearable clarity, the full weight of what he's done. He can't hide behind justifications. Reason can't silence the heart. And this split between thought and conscience pushes him to the edge of insanity. Here, Dostoevsky offers a disturbing idea. Sometimes, going mad is the only sane reaction to a morally insane world. This theme appears again in other works. In The Demons, for example, the collapse of faith and morality leads the characters into ideological delusion, suicide, and murder. The modern world, without God, without absolutes, without transcendence, turns into a giant ethical madhouse where everyone invents their own truth and tries to enforce it through violence. To Dostoevsky, losing the spiritual core of life doesn't bring freedom. It brings chaos. Man without God doesn't become rational. He becomes confused, divided, desperate. And in that scenario, it's the most sensitive, the most ethical, the most aware who begin to fall apart from the inside out. They go mad, not because they're wrong, but because they're too right. They see the horror so clearly that they can't bear it. In Dostoevsky's world, it's often the madman who speaks the deepest truths. He's the outsider, the one who doesn't fit in, the one who refuses to play the social game. While the normal people live on the surface, the madman says what no one wants to hear. This figure appears in almost all his novels. The underground man, the idiot, the dreamer, the beggar, the sinner confessing his soul. They aren't models of balance, but they are mirrors of the human soul in its rawest, most authentic form. And because of that, they make us uncomfortable. They expose us. They confront us. They remind us of what we try to forget, that living truthfully comes at a cost. Dostoevsky doesn't glorify madness for its own sake. What he shows is that sometimes the pain of consciousness is necessary. It's what opens the door to repentance, to transformation, to redemption. Raskolnikov only begins to heal when he accepts his guilt, when he kneels before life, when he lets go of cynical reason and embraces faith, humility, and suffering as paths to rebuild himself. Lucidity, then, is not the goal. It's a passage, a fire that burns away illusions, a desert that prepares the soul for something greater. But there's a danger. If lucidity doesn't find meaning, it can consume the soul. That's why Dostoevsky insists on the need for transcendence. Reason alone can't save us. Consciousness without faith can turn into despair. This is where the spiritual dimension of Dostoevsky's work becomes clear. Faith, for him, is not an escape from reality. It's a response to its brutality. It's not a cheap comfort, but a deep resistance. It's what keeps lucidity from becoming self-destruction. Prince Mishkin, in The Idiot, is a perfect example. He is pure, sensitive, compassionate, and for that, he's seen as insane. But his madness is really a kind of holiness. He loves where others hate. He forgives where others condemn. He suffers, but doesn't grow bitter. His spiritual clarity is misunderstood. He's treated as a fool, as weak, but perhaps he's the sanest of them all. Dostoevsky shows us that true lucidity must be tied to compassion. To see the world as it really is, and not go mad, one must be anchored in love, in forgiveness, in God. Madness or faithfulness to the soul. In the end, Dostoevsky leaves us with this question. What is madness? Adapting to a crazy world, or resisting it, even if it costs your sanity? Maybe, as he suggests, the truly mad are those who feel nothing, who live without guilt, without pain, without awe, and maybe those who suffer, who wrestle with themselves, who feel anguish, are the only ones still truly alive inside. The human mind is petty and proud, more destructive than creative. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Demons. The greatest danger doesn't always come from ignorance. Sometimes the most destructive force is the one that thinks too much and feels too little. For Dostoevsky, intelligence without humility can become a weapon, not of progress, but of moral, spiritual, and even civilizational collapse. The human mind, so praised by Enlightenment thinkers and modern rationalists, is not neutral. It's capable of wonders, yes, but also of horrors, especially when it turns inward and places itself above good and evil. It's in this fertile ground of intellectual pride that ego takes root, blind ideology flourishes, and ethical collapse begins. In Demons, Dostoevsky presents brilliant characters, visionaries, strategists of a new society, men of logic, revolution, and pure reason. But the more refined their ideas, the more numb they become to real human beings. These characters don't love people, they love their projects. They don't engage with pain, they calculate social impact. And so, trapped in formulas and ideologies, they lose their souls. The result isn't liberation, it's annihilation. A proud mind turns others into objects. It reduces human beings to mistakes, statistics, obstacles. Reason drifts away from reality and starts to see the world as a technical issue, not a spiritual drama. And when that happens, destruction hides behind the mask of progress. Dostoevsky foresaw what the 20th century would prove so brutally, that the worst crimes can be committed by educated men. Intelligence, far from being an antidote to evil, can actually become its ally when stripped of ethics. Intellectual pride shows up when someone believes that understanding more makes them worth more, when they think their ideas justify the suffering of others, when they believe they can manipulate lives in the name of a greater cause. That kind of mind doesn't create, as Dostoevsky warns. It destroys. Because without humility, the mind stops serving others and starts serving only its own ego. There's a kind of thinking that disguises itself as wisdom, but is really just vanity. It seeks to win arguments, humiliate opponents, look superior. It's not after truth. It's after intellectual glory. This is the kind of mind Dostoevsky calls petty and proud. A mind that's not interested in the truth of the human heart, only in the brilliance of its own thoughts. This pride is subtle. It can hide behind beautiful words, refined quotes, and altruistic speeches. But deep down, it reveals a kind of spiritual narcissism, the need to always be right. And someone who is always right doesn't learn, doesn't listen, doesn't love. Dostoevsky's philosophy doesn't separate reason from faith by accident. To him, faith serves a purpose beyond belief. It humbles pride. It reminds the thinker that there's something greater than their mind, that the mystery of existence doesn't fit into intellectual frameworks. Faith teaches the thinker to kneel, and for the proud, that's unbearable. That's why the smartest characters in Dostoevsky's novels often collapse. Not because they lack reason, but because they're consumed by pride. They can't believe, because they can't bow. And that rigidity is what breaks them. The humble ones, like Alyosha or Father Zosima, don't shine through rhetoric, but through presence. They understand more because they feel more. They know that truth isn't just in ideas, but in the love that transforms. Dostoevsky was deeply concerned about the rise of modern ideologies. To him, these were closed, rational systems created by intellectuals who wanted to explain and control all of reality. Revolutionary socialism, scientism, rational nihilism, they all promise salvation without transcendence. These ideologies, often created by brilliant men, shared one fatal flaw. They ignored the complexity of the human being. They ignored the heart, the soul, repentance, love. They wanted to fix the world with formulas, but ignored the pain of those living in it. For Dostoevsky, the result would be catastrophic, because when someone loves a system more than people, they're willing to sacrifice lives for the sake of an idea. And reason, then, becomes a tool for oppression. In contrast to the proud thinker, Dostoevsky elevates the figure of the humble sage, the one who knows he doesn't know everything, who recognizes the limits of reason, who doesn't seek to win debates, but to hear the silence. This kind of wisdom is more fruitful than any genius, because it's rooted in love. A proud mind destroys because it imposes. A humble mind creates because it serves. The first breeds fear. The second builds trust. The first builds cold systems. The second nurtures living communities. Another powerful insight in Dostoevsky's critique is the inner suffering of the proud intellectual. He doesn't just destroy the world around him, he destroys himself. A mind that won't surrender, that won't open, that stays closed, becomes a prison. It thinks, but doesn't feel. It understands, but doesn't forgive. It sees everything, except itself. That's the tragedy of many characters in Demons. They're consumed by their own hollow brilliance. Intelligence, when it becomes an end in itself, doesn't lead to wisdom, but to isolation. And in that isolation, pride becomes unbearable and leads to ruin. Dostoevsky was no enemy of intelligence. On the contrary, he was one of the most brilliant thinkers of his time, but he knew that for intellect to be constructive, it must submit to the truth of the heart. Reason alone is not enough. Without ethics, without compassion, without spirituality, it loses its way. The human mind, with all its beauty and power, only reaches its full potential when it admits its limits and opens itself to others. The true thinker is not the one who controls ideas, but the one who lets them transform him, and who uses his knowledge to heal, not to harm. Children are pure and sacred. Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Brothers Karamazov. When Dostoevsky says that children are pure and sacred, he's not just making a sentimental statement about childhood. He's saying something theological, existential, and deeply ethical. Childhood is the closest image of what humanity once was, and perhaps of what it should still be. At the same time, it's the most painful mirror of the moral decay of the adult world. In Dostoevsky's work, the child represents the uncorrupted sacred, a symbol of original purity, spontaneous trust, and the ability to love without self-interest. And for that very reason, the suffering of a child becomes, in his stories, a silent and unforgiving accusation against humanity. When a child suffers, there is no philosophical or rational excuse that can absolve us. A child's pain is the purest cry against evil. Dostoevsky doesn't idealize childhood as perfection, but he sees in it a kind of purity untouched by social masks, by cynicism, by the systematized selfishness of adult life. A child feels deeply, trusts easily, forgives quickly. Their sensitivity is raw and real, and that kind of purity is uncomfortable because it exposes, by contrast, the hypocrisy of adults. While we learn to fake, to manipulate, to justify our mistakes, the child still lives with an open heart. They don't understand the world through rational filters, but through the direct truth of the soul. That's exactly why, for Dostoevsky, the child becomes a symbol of the sacred. As Jesus said in the Gospels, "Unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Childhood here is a symbol of nearness to the eternal, not because it knows more, but because it remains untouched by pride and vanity. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan makes one of the most powerful objections ever raised against the existence of God, the suffering of children. He's not questioning evil in general or human free will. He refuses to accept a universe where an innocent child can be tortured. For him, no future harmony, no paradise to come can justify such horror. Ivan's crisis isn't just moral, it's metaphysical. He sees in a child's suffering the collapse of any theodicy, any attempt to explain evil in light of a good God. And his pain isn't cynical, it's sincere. He's not an atheist out of arrogance, but because he cannot accept a world that allows such injustice. Dostoevsky doesn't offer a direct answer to Ivan's objection. He lets it hang in the air, because maybe there is no rational answer that suffices. The suffering of a child isn't a problem to be solved. It's an abyss before which we're left only with silence, compassion, and tears. And yet, by leaving the question open, Dostoevsky reveals something even deeper. If there is anything that truly condemns the world, it's the pain of the small and innocent. That pain is what exposes the moral failure of humanity. If the suffering of a child is unacceptable, it's because we recognize, intuitively, that there's something sacred in it. And that recognition isn't just instinct, it's a spiritual experience. The child confronts us with the original beauty of existence, with the possibility of selfless love, with a kind of faith that isn't calculated. In many of Dostoevsky's works, characters are transformed by their encounters with children. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, is touched by Sonia and her little sister, and in that contact with innocence, his conscience begins to awaken. Prince Mishkin, in The Idiot, is almost a grown-up child himself, a man with an innocent soul, surrounded by a corrupt world and misunderstood because of it. For Dostoevsky, the child is a window to the divine, not in a dogmatic sense, but in the most visceral dimension of spiritual experience, the mystery of love without self-interest, of joy without calculation, of presence without masks. Many of life's adult tragedies, in Dostoevsky's view, come from forgetting our inner child. As we grow older, we harden, we rationalize, we justify our coldness, we abandon spontaneity, generosity, and faith. This process is almost like a fall, not just a moral one, but an ontological fall, a separation from our own center. We forget who we were, and in forgetting, we lose ourselves. To recover that childhood, not biologically, but spiritually, is a path to salvation. Becoming like a child in this context means returning to our essence, to our first love, to our purest hope. It means rehumanizing ourselves. When a child's innocence is violated by violence, neglect, or exploitation, something deep rips through the moral fabric of reality. For Dostoevsky, this isn't just a social crime, it's a spiritual sin of cosmic proportions. Because what is destroyed isn't just a body or a mind. What's destroyed is the very possibility of redemption. That's why, in his novels, a child's suffering is never background noise. It's the breaking point, the moment when civilization can no longer defend itself. The quietest and harshest judge. When the world allows children to be abandoned, abused, or forgotten, it accuses itself. No policy, no progress, no speech can wipe away that stain. A child's pain, in Dostoevsky's work, isn't an impersonal tragedy. It always points to responsibility. And that responsibility is ours. Every time we become indifferent, every time we prioritize systems over people, every time we turn away from misery, we wound childhood. And more than that, we lose our ability to connect with the sacred. Because, as Dostoevsky insists, it is in the purity of the child that God reveals himself. The face of God is in the eyes of those who haven't yet learned to hate, to lie, or to hurt. And for that reason, those who destroy childhood walk away from the light. The truth is always implausible. To make it plausible, you have to lie a little. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the demons, saying that truth needs to be dressed up in lies to become acceptable, might seem like a contradiction at first. But Dostoevsky isn't defending dishonesty. He's exposing one of the most disturbing traits of the human condition. Deep existential truth is often unbearable to reason. It goes beyond what seems plausible. It breaks logic apart. That's why, in order to live with it, or at least touch it, we need fiction, metaphor, art, religion, imagination. We live on the edge of an abyss. The abyss of mystery, of the inexplicable, of the tragic. And it's in that space, where reason stumbles, that Dostoevsky finds his most unsettling philosophy. Existence cannot be fully explained. It can only be faced. Dostoevsky knew that truth, when taken to its ultimate consequences, is not comforting. It's scandalous. It shatters illusions. It reveals not just the nature of the world, but the rawness of our own inner selves. That's why, as he ironically suggests, in order for truth to be accepted, it must be softened, dramatized, made more palatable. This is where fiction comes in, not as deception, but as a bridge. For Dostoevsky, literature doesn't hide the truth. It makes it accessible. Paradoxically, it's through invention that we come closest to what is real. In his novels, the characters aren't just social types or narrative devices. They are living embodiments of ideas, existential dramas that force us to confront our own inner voids. It's as if, in order to reveal reality, Dostoevsky had to dive into the appearance of unreality. The truth Dostoevsky presents isn't factual. It's not scientific or logical truth. It's the truth of the soul. And this truth is soaked in paradox. Man desires freedom, but fears what it demands. He longs for good, yet is drawn to evil. He seeks immortality, but lives surrounded by death. This tension between desire and limit, between awareness and instinct, between reason and faith, this is the existential abyss. There's no solid ground, no final answers, only questions, anguish, contradictions, and the need to keep going anyway. That's why Dostoevsky doesn't offer closed philosophical systems. He offers characters in crisis, in freefall, in search, because, to him, existence isn't something you solve. It's something you live through. And to live through it, you need courage. When Dostoevsky says, to make the truth plausible, you have to lie a little, he's pointing to one of the noblest purposes of art, to lie on the surface in order to reveal what lies at the core. That's what parables, myths, novels, and poetry do. In that sense, literature isn't less true than philosophy or science. It's a different kind of truth. A truth that doesn't argue, it touches. That doesn't convince, it transforms. That's why his novels are full of contradictions, of characters who say one thing and do another, of chaotic dialogues, of unlikely events. The form may seem messy, but that apparent chaos is meant to reflect the real chaos of the human soul. And fiction, the lie, becomes paradoxically a more faithful way to express truth than logic ever could. One of Dostoevsky's core ideas is that reason alone cannot capture the full range of human experience. The modern attempt to reduce everything to logic, measurement, and science ends up ignoring the deepest layers of our being. This pure reason, without imagination, without faith, without art, becomes deaf to the human cry. It cannot understand a love that forgives the unforgivable, or the kind of suffering that redeems, or sacrifice that brings meaning. It only accepts what it can measure, and in doing so, it misses what matters most. That's why, for Dostoevsky, living with clarity means living in tension. It's knowing that there is no manual, that truth is often implausible, that life is both tragically beautiful and inexplicably cruel, and that, even so, it has meaning. To live is to stare into the abyss and keep walking. This is the existential stance that rises from Dostoevsky's work. His characters are always on the edge of something, a crime, a confession, a breakdown, a spiritual awakening. And that's no coincidence. He saw life as a state of liminality. We're never completely saved, nor entirely lost. We are creatures in struggle. This abyss isn't just psychological, it's metaphysical. It's the absence of absolute certainties. It's the awareness of our mortality. It's the longing for eternity inside a body that dies. But it's precisely in that abyss that Dostoevsky locates the dignity of the human being. Because it's there that freedom is revealed, there that love is tested, there that faith, if it comes, will be real, not inherited. For Dostoevsky, truth reveals itself only to those with a heart strong enough to bear it. Thinking isn't enough. You have to feel it, suffer it, surrender to it. Reason may point the way, but it's the heart that chooses. And often, what seems implausible to the intellect is obvious to the soul. That's why his work challenges the reader to go beyond rational limits, to dive into contradiction, paradox, the incomprehensible, because it's there, in that unstable ground, that truth lives. And maybe that's why literature is so powerful. It lets us enter the implausible without getting lost in it. It shows us truth dressed as lies, and by doing that, returns us to reality with wider, clearer eyes. We've reached the end of this deep journey through the philosophical universe of Fyodor Dostoevsky, a thinker of the soul, of pain, of freedom and redemption. If you've made it this far, I truly thank you. Your time, your attention, and your interest in such essential topics are what keep this channel alive and meaningful. Now, if this content touched you in any way, if it sparked a reflection, a question, or even an uncomfortable but necessary thought, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps YouTube understand that this kind of content matters and should reach more people. Share it with friends who love philosophy, literature, or are searching for meaning. Dostoevsky is, above all, an invitation to inner transformation, and maybe someone close to you needs to hear his words today. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We're just getting started. There's so much more coming. Reflections on great philosophers, deep literary analyses, ethical and existential dilemmas, all explored with thoughtfulness and humanity. Leave a comment below. Which of these 20 lessons impacted you the most? What got you thinking? Your opinion is a vital part of this space. I read every comment carefully. And don't leave just yet. There's a lot more waiting for you here on the channel. Keep exploring our videos, dive into more reflections, and let philosophy keep walking alongside you. See you in the next video. And remember, to think is to live more deeply. Thank you for being here.